Right, so first, should let you know, or remind you, this is the first time I've tried to do interpretation of ancient Greek texts in the classroom. Right, so I selected an excerpt from the Theaetetus for our first lecture, and an excerpt from the Meno for the second one. And by this way, I'm going to try and convey something of the flavor. Well, there's a lot of things I want to do with this. I want to give some of the flavor of an ancient Socratic dialogue, which was sort of the beginning of philosophy. I want to give you some idea of how a philosophical discussion goes and how Socrates did it, or at least how Socrates said he did it. We have an image of Socrates, which may or may not be accurate, and we have things that Socrates said about himself. So this is sort of the ancient theory of how philosophy is supposed to go, and that we're going to get that from this excerpt from the Theaetetus. And so this is sort of an introduction to the whole subject of philosophy through ancient Greek, an ancient Greek text. The other thing is that I'm going to give you some ancient arguments, some of the very, very earliest arguments in philosophy. There's a chair over there, if you would like to get up and go. And see me at the break about your attendance. Right. Just, you can walk in front of the camera. Oh, it's so nice you ducked down. So that's it. So now, the first lecture, this before the break, is all about what philosophy. It's a statement. It's not really an argument. Socrates is just talking about what he tries to do or what he imagines that he's doing. And then the second one, when we do the excerpt from the Meno, that will be an actual argument. And it's an ancient argument. It's one of the very earliest arguments in philosophy. And to understand that to understand something about it, we have a great deal of respect for this argument in philosophy, because it's our heritage, it's part of what started the whole thing going. But I don't think anyone nowadays thinks that this is a good argument. And that's okay. It was a good argument at the time. You guys know what a Model T Ford is, right? How many of you know what a Stanley steamer is? It's an automobile that's even more primitive than a Model T Ford. It's an earlier one, and it had a steam engine. It also had a steering handle, a tiller, like a boat. So instead of turning a wheel, you'd hold this knob and move it back and forth on this big old lever to make the thing go. Now, if somebody marketed a vehicle like that now to compete with, the Toyota Camry and the Honda Civic, would they sell any? No, they wouldn't. People would not buy these vehicles unless they were like reenactors or something, or weirdos. Generally speaking, the public would not buy these vehicles because as a vehicle, the Model T Ford and the Stanley Steamer and the other old ones are vastly inferior to the Honda Civic. But they were great at the time. They were cutting edge. And so you can see that the Meno, which we'll look at, it's terrible. It looks like a terrible argument now, but at the time it was cutting edge. So we're looking at stuff that was cutting edge thinking about 3,000 years ago. And from that we'll have an idea of how philosophy works. One of the advantages, by the way, of looking at the Meno is that it's a well-respected, very famous argument that is complete rubbish. And that happens even now today. There are philosophers who hold distinguished professorships, world-famous philosophers, who give arguments that, in my view, are complete rubbish. And while it's forgivable for Socrates to have done it 3,000 years ago, because hell, no one had done philosophy before Socrates. It's not forgivable for somebody running around today to give an argument that's complete rubbish. So I want us to look at arguments in a sort of engaged, critical respect. To say, okay, this is an ancient argument, it's famous, it's been studied again and again and again, it's been translated multiple times, but we can look at it and say, and figure out for ourselves, is this a good or bad argument? Now, in my opinion, it's a bad argument. You might disagree with me, and as always, if you disagree with me about something, about an important topic, that makes an opportunity for a paper. You could write a paper on that and say, well, Dr. Young says this, or you say this, and I think this is wrong because of this. And you write your paper, and you lay out an argument, and I look at your argument, and if it's a reasonable and thoughtful argument, you get credit. And you don't have to be right, you just have to be reasonable and thoughtful and be trying to be logical. Does that make sense? Right. So, the problem is, never done this before. Right? I've never gone over a text, and that's why I chose an easy one to start with. So what we're going to do is go through all these questions about the Theaetetus and try and lay out what Socrates is saying here and what this tells us about the enterprise of philosophy as Socrates conceived it and as I conceive it today and as I want you to understand it. All right. So is that clear?
Yes.
Has anyone got any questions? Questions are good. If you have a question, I like answering questions.
Yeah.
Okay, good. So I'm going to, all right. So the first of the quiz questions was, how is Theaetetus pregnant? What did that say? Does anyone, want to take a go at? Yes, answering
I
that.
got it. He was pregnant with an idea.
He's pregnant with an idea,
Ah.
right? We're pregnant with ideas, and that's so. How is Socrates a midwife? Yes.
Because he gives birth to ideas from the young.
Could you rephrase that? You said he gives birth. Is that what a midwife does?
No, the midwife is like a person who gives childbirth.
They assisted it, yeah.
He helps this person deliver the idea, bring it to life.
Right. You help the person deliver the idea. Right. And I want to suggest to you that in general, that's one of the functions. It's one of the functions of a good teacher in any class, particularly in a philosophy class, but it's sort of in any class, because if you have a good teacher, English composition, history, or anything like that, you'll get some of the enthusiasm, you'll get some of the excitement about the discipline, whatever it is, and you'll have ideas. Right? You've ever been sitting in a class and the professor is droning on about something, and you start thinking, well, he's saying all this stuff, but I think this other thing, this seems like another thing, and he's not saying that, right? If you have sat there and you've had an idea, and have you been in the class where you think, if I put my hand up and talk about it, he's not really going to be receptive. That's bad teaching. If the professor is not receptive to your idea, sometimes, you've got to keep going. Right? I've had students have good ideas, and I had to say, yes, that's good, I want to see a paper about that, but I have to move on. Right? But a professor, you talk to the professor, when you feel comfortable coming up to the professor after the class and saying, when you were saying this thing, I thought this. And if he's a good professor, he'll go, oh, they teach us to do that, by the way. You move one hand to the chin, the other one to the elbow. Oh, that's why I had to grow the beard. Otherwise, I got nothing to stroke there. No, the professor's supposed to say, to be open and say, oh, that's an interesting idea. And even if I think the idea is completely wrong, I'm really supposed to, it's my job and my duty as a human being to be supportive and say, okay, yeah, do you think you want to develop that? Well, what about this? What about that? Right? So, the midwife of ideas. Okay, a good teacher is supposed to be a midwife of ideas. Now, how do others? What did Socrates say about how others describe him? Anyone? Yes.
An eccentric man.
An eccentric man. Who would go further, perhaps more negatively? Yes.
Draws men to distraction.
Drives men to distraction. Yes.
Kind of a bit critical.
Bit critical. How about a one-word description? Perhaps starting with a synonym for donkey. Right, and ending with a synonym for cavity. I don't know, I couldn't think of it if it wasn't obscene. Right, so yeah, other people will describe Socrates in less than flattering terms, as an annoying person, an irritating person. Right. So what does he do that's so irritating?
Ask other people's opinions, but doesn't really give his own.
That's one thing, yeah, and he said that, right? Does he go further than that? Well, he actually does go further than that in many of these dialogues. He said driving men to distraction. How does he drive men to distraction? Do you guys think? Because I just realized it wasn't in the text. I'm asking you a question for which the answer was not in the text. Yeah?
Does he derail their ideas?
Yeah. That's one thing that he does. He asks them questions they can't answer. Right. Or that they find hard to answer, we'll say. So, all right. What does Socrates do that midwives don't?
Help them.
Say again?
Work with men and help them.
Help them? Well, midwives help them. I mean, a midwife...
With men though?
By the way, anyone here studied feminist history? Does anyone have any idea why there are fewer midwives proportionally today? Why there's almost no midwives in modern American mainstream society?
I thought it's good for insurance and hospital and all that.
Yeah, well, why were those things created? It used to be the case in Europe, for instance, in the hospitals, that if someone had called a midwife in, they were much more likely to have a healthy birth and a surviving mother than if they went to a hospital. If they went to a hospital, they get something, very likely to get something called childbed fever, which would kill them. Mothers would die in hospitals, but if they stayed at home and had their birth. Why don't we do that anymore? It's because hospitals and doctors have a good lobby and midwives don't.
Yeah.
Right? Midwives are actually coming back into fashion. So there are a lot more practicing midwives. Midwives are almost erased from American mainstream, from the white bread American mainstream society. Right. But a midwife is a woman, generally a woman, who knows what goes on with when someone's about to give birth.
That's because what he was talking about, because people who have given children before are better as a helper, and the people who are barren don't do that
Yeah,
part.
he says that.
Yeah.
I'm not sure really how it's important to what I'm trying to say.
I don't know, but
yes,
yeah, I'm confused.
Did you had a comment?
I was gonna say because they have something physical and he's only gonna make it.
Yeah, here's a physical thing, but there's something. All right, there's a metaphor. There's a rather cruel metaphor that Socrates used. By the way, 3,000 years ago, attitudes towards newborn infants were very different. Nowadays, we generally tend to see a newborn infant as a very precious thing. Ancient societies generally would not name a child until it was a couple of weeks old. Do you know why?
Because odds are it would die.
Odds are it would die, yes. Yeah, right. Right. And ancient Greece and ancient Rome, even more harsh. Child would be inspected, not by the woman, not by the midwife, usually by the paterfamilias, the father, head of household, and they say, yeah, I guess we'll keep this one.
Oh,
Right. And if they said, no, they would expose the child. They'd go and leave it somewhere to die, which is an absolutely horrific thing that never makes it into the gladiator movies. So they would cull their own population. And this is related to Socrates is how, do you guys know what a changeling is? Yeah.
And like a folklore way of describing a child that has a disease or a disorder. Like
That's a modern interpretation. What would the medieval person?
Well, they would assume that it's a replaced child with something that isn't normal or it has an issue.
Right. It's a changeling is a replacement child left by the fairies. Right. So, and you're right. It is hooked into folk beliefs about mental illness or bad behavior by children. But the ancient belief, pre-Christian belief, was that, if your kid's acting out what we now call ADHD or autism, or it's not actually your child, that's a changeling left by the fairies. You see, you wouldn't expect your actual child to be only 2 feet tall and have gossamer wings, would you? Right, so, the kid's flying around the house. Really? That's a changeling left by the fairies? I never knew. So, it's a folkloric belief. Now, the ancient Greeks didn't seem to have this belief because Socrates would have mentioned it. Ancient Greek, so imagine there's a midwife who not just takes the child up and goes, okay, have to do a fairy test. Wings, little, I don't know, antenna. I don't know about fairies. Is it like really dainty, smaller? All I know about them is wings, actually. Or does it have like, I don't know, Liz Brown, he said having like an 8-foot nose or something like that. So, you look at them and you make sure it's not a changeling. And what Socrates is talking about that he does that regular midwives don't is like, is this a good idea or a bad idea? You have to test to see if it's a good idea or a bad idea. Like you might have to test to see whether this is a real human child or a changeling. So that's what Socrates does that midwives don't do. And Socrates says there's two kinds of ideas. There's ideas that are good and there are ideas that are bad. And that is an important part of the definition of philosophy, is that philosophy is about telling which ideas are good and telling which ideas are bad. And I don't know, if there really are fairies, it's probably really hard to tell, a fairy from a real fairy child from a real one. But good ideas and bad ideas are really difficult to tell apart. Some bad ideas persist over hundreds of years, maybe thousands of years. All right. And this happens in science too, not just philosophy. In science, for like 2,000 years or more, people believed there were 4 elements: earth, air, fire, and water. And it wasn't until, I don't know, it's like the 18th century. It wasn't until relatively recently that they were able to tell that there weren't just 4 elements, there were more elements than that. They decided that the theory of the 4 elements was no good, and they adopted something called atomic theory, which is actually older than the four elements theory, but everybody ignored it. But it was a great idea. People ignored it for over 2,000 years, 2,500 years. They got this great idea. Nobody pays attention to it. They follow the bad idea. And that's in science where they can do experiments to figure stuff out. In philosophy, we can't do experiments. We do arguments. We do logical analysis. And there are bad ideas that have persisted in philosophy for thousands of years, and it was only comparatively recently that we were able to figure out that these ideas were bad. So it's hard. So Socrates is right. It's part of the philosopher's job to tell good ideas from bad ideas, right? But it's not something you can do just right away. And that's actually characteristic of the Socratic dialogues. If you look at the Socratic dialogues, if you go and read some more of them, and actually they're all, because they're out of copyright, so there's a lot of Socratic dialogues online. You can just go and read straight off the screen. You find that they go back and forth and almost never come to a conclusion. Right. Socrates will be talking to some guy, and they'll talk for like hours and hours and hours, and at the end they say, well, I don't know, do you know? No, I don't know either. And you read it and think, well, okay, I guess that was fun. But have you ever had a really good conversation with someone about something you're really interested in, and at the end of it, you haven't really come to a conclusion, but you've made some kind of progress, and you understand stuff a bit more, and you feel like, yeah, maybe I can understand this, and I'll just keep thinking about it. So it's a productive conversation. So philosophy, historically, has made progress by inches, a little bit here, a little bit there. There'll be this conversation, that conversation. And when we look at the history of philosophy, it's going to be very compressed. Sometimes I'll jump over hundreds of years and say, yeah, well, there was this, and then there was this, 500 years later. So, right. So Socrates has this whole deal that he doesn't know anything. He knows nothing, right? If you've ever heard that story. And he thinks he's smarter than other people because they think they know something, whereas he knows that they don't know, and he knows that he doesn't know. He knows that nobody knows, so he knows something that they don't. Right? Okay, sometimes we make a big deal about that, but the thing is here, the one thing to look at this, ignorance is okay. At least ignorance in the sense of not knowing, right? I don't know about ignorance, you're not ignoring anything, but it's okay if you don't know. Right? By the way, when you come to write your papers, I want your first line to be your thesis, but your thesis could be, I don't know. I haven't come to an answer. You might have done a lot of thinking. You might be able to fill up 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 pages with your thinking and say, I thought this, but that was wrong because of this. I thought this and this and this, but then I thought that, and then this is, and I can't decide between this. I don't know if it's this thing is this or that. That's writing down your thinking process, and every little bit of your thinking process can go into the page and can be worth credit. So everything you think, every idea you come up with can go into the paper. So I'm expecting a mixture of papers, some of which will start, here's the thesis and it'll be proved brilliantly. Or here's the thesis and it'll be completely wrong, but there's some good thinking in there, right? So that's still worth something. And then there'll be 1 or 2 papers that say, I don't understand this. I understand this bit and this bit and this bit, but I don't know if this thing is this or that. And actually, demonstrating that you understand why you don't know something is actually kind of cool. It's a step, it's progress. So you demonstrate progress in thinking about something, that's a good thing, and sometimes it can be worth a lot of credit. Did that make sense?
Yeah.
Right. So it makes sense for Socrates and his person he's talking to agree that neither of them knows something, because that's better than thinking you know when you don't know. Do you ever run into that? Someone who's talking a lot about something he knows nothing about? Yeah, I used to run into that quite a lot, and I hang out with different people, so it doesn't happen quite so much. But it's quite amazing how people can go on and on and on and on and demonstrate quite conclusively that they have no idea of what they're talking about, and have no idea that they have no idea. So, at least to get past that is part of the task of philosophy. So, that's what Socrates does for people. All right, so what does Socrates tell Theaetetus to do? What does Socrates tell Theaetetus to do? Yes?
Let go of his ideas.
That's one, yeah, that is one thing he says. He does want people to let go of his ideas. But there is something specific he says in the text that I had a little question about. So did anyone notice that?
Just answer the questions just as he asks them.
Right. Answer the questions as I ask them. As I ask them. Answer my questions. Just as I ask them. Now this, it's just a tiny little bit of the dialogue, but for me, this is the kingpin. This is the keystone. This is the thing that actually holds it together. This is the motor, the fuel injector of the dialogue. In order for Socrates to function as this midwife of ideas, the person he's working with has to answer his questions just as he asks them. And I can tell you this from experience, because I have had students come to talk to me about their papers. Right, now this is a good thing. If you're writing a paper, or if you've written a paper and it's gotten a bad grade or comments, and you don't understand why your paper has got a bad grade, going to the professor is a good idea. And of course, every professor should be open for this. And when you go out to university, you'll go to the teaching assistants or the professor. And they should be open and willing to spend time with you to explain what's wrong with the paper. Now, the teaching assistant's problem, or the professor's problem, when talking to a student who's written a paper that's got wrong, is to find out what the student is thinking when they wrote that paper and correct that. Because most of us are not really capable of just listening to the explanation and then taking that away and following it. Most people, when they write a paper, when they take the paper to the professor for an explanation, have in their minds, this was the right way to do it. Right? This is what I was thinking. I need to get across to the professor that this is what I was thinking, and then he'll change the grade. And then they're shocked when the professor doesn't change the grade, and the professor explains why, and to them it's like and then they go away and say, well, he didn't explain what's wrong with my paper. And the professor, usually, the professor did explain, but they just didn't listen. Have you ever had that happen to you? Someone screwed something up, or someone's asking you how to do something, and you tell them how to do it, but you can see they've already got an idea. And their idea is very different from what you're telling them. And they're not really listening to what you're saying. They're just thinking in their head that idea that they've got. Have you ever told someone exactly what to do, and then they went away and did something completely different? And they come back and say, well, I did what you told me. I said, I didn't tell you to do that. I told you not to do that. Well, I was on you. And it's because they didn't listen. They had an idea which they think is right, and they're talking to you to try and get you to agree with their idea, even though it's wrong, because they don't recognize that it's wrong. I had a student once had written a terrible paper. He'd made a fundamental mistake in even how he approached the problem, even how he was writing the paper. It was a fundamental mistake. And he comes in and he asks me, what's wrong? He asks me, what's wrong with my paper? And I say, it's this. You were supposed to do this, but you did this other thing instead. And I explain, I explain what to do, blah, 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 blah. And as I'm talking to him, he's like this. He's like agitated, and he doesn't look like he's listening at all. And I say, stop, what did I just tell you? And he couldn't tell me what I just told him. And I said, look, this is what you have to do. And a week later, he came back to me and he said, when we were talking before, I wasn't really listening. I was just waiting for you to stop talking so I could explain what I was doing in my paper. And here's a really, really important hint. For any class you're ever in, if you get a bad grade on your paper, don't go to the professor and try to explain what you were thinking when you wrote the paper. Because the professor already knows that, unless he's a terrible professor. But the professor already knows what you were thinking when you wrote the paper. And what he's told you is that thinking was wrong. And so you don't go to the professor and say, well, I think that 2 plus 2 is 7, so you should give me a good grade for my paper. You should listen to him when he says, no, actually 2 plus 2 is 4, it's not 7. Or what you said was wrong, this is the right thing. And get that new thing. One way to tell whether you've had a successful meeting with a professor or with a teaching assistant, if you go away knowing something new about the issue, if you go away going, oh, I thought it was this, it's really that. If you go away thinking like that, that's probably a successful meeting with the professor because you've learned something. But if you go away thinking the same thing you were thinking before you saw the professor, it's a failure. The professor has failed to communicate with you, or you failed to listen to the professor. So, one thing I'm going to try to do to get around this is if people come to me and say, what's wrong with my paper, or what was wrong with my exam, and I explain it to them, before they leave, I'm going to ask them to tell me what I just said. And if they can't tell me what I just said, I'm going to say, look, you didn't listen. You need to listen. I'm going to explain it again. This time listen, write down what I'm saying as I say it, and then get it. And this is actually, I'm beating this to death because this is actually really an important block. I mean, it's not everybody that does this, and nobody does it all the time. But you can get into a state where you're actually not listening. You've got this thing you want to say to the professor, and you have no actual interest in finding out what the professor has to say. So it's important to come with an attitude of, I'm going to listen, I'm going to find out what the professor has to say. You may not agree with it. It's okay not to agree with what the professor says, but it's not okay to ignore it and to come away without what the professor is trying to say. Did that make any sense? That's a sort of cognitive thing. Now, one of the big things in communicating with someone about something they don't understand, and I see this, I have people ask me about things, what is this? And I'll see that they don't understand it. One of the things I will do is I will ask a pointed question, a focused question, because I'll identify the thing they're not thinking about. And usually the reason we don't understand something is we're not really thinking about it. We're really not thinking about the most important part of it. We're not thinking about the thing that makes the difference. And so I'll ask a question about the thing that makes a difference. And what usually happens when I'm talking to a student who doesn't understand this thing is that they will try to avoid answering the question. They'll start talking about something else. So I'll say, you know, is this object black or white? And they'll say, well, I was thinking that we'd look at the mating habits of weasels. And I say, well, no. You have to think about this now. You have to think about, is this object black or white? And sometimes people are like, they just don't want to talk about that. Right? And it's kind of shocking to me because like they don't want to understand. So what I want to say to you for the practice of philosophy in this class and for your own communication outside is don't let people avoid questions, right? If you want to communicate something to someone, ask what they think about the thing that's most important. Because you can have this where you can give a full and complete explanation and it just goes right by the person. And you have no idea whether they're listening or not. Sometimes they're listening, sometimes they're not. But if you engage them in the process and you ask them a question, they can't avoid that point. Right? So you try and frame a question that if they answer the question, if they answer the exact question you've asked, they'll get it. Have you ever had this thing where you ask someone a question and they answer a different question? Yeah, it used to happen to me all the time. And I had this happen once where I'd asked a question and the person I was talking to answered a completely different question. Okay, well, that's not an answer to my question, so I asked the question again. Then they answer a third question that has nothing to do with what. And I asked the question again, and they say something else that's not an answer to the question. I got so mad I had to walk out of the room to avoid screaming. It's very frustrating. So if I ask you a question in this class, you should answer the question that I'm asking and not talk about something else. If you're trying to explain something to someone, and you ask them a question and they don't answer it, ask them again. Say, no, I need the answer. And just keep going until they either answer the question or run away or turn into fairies and fly away. I don't know, it might be changelings. So this is what Socrates tells Theaetetus to do, is when I ask you a question, you answer the question that I have asked as best you can. Then you give the answer and I'll ask another question, and another question, and another question. And if you look in the dialogue, Socrates makes some statements, but mostly, even when he's making a statement, he phrases it as a question. Right? At least half of what he says is questions, and then Theaetetus does that. Well, sometimes it's, one of the things that's wrong with the dialogues is sometimes it's, Socrates says, don't you think it's this and this? And the other guy says, why, yes, Socrates. And don't you think it's that and the other? And the other person says, well, yes, Socrates, certainly, you're right. You're wonderful, Socrates. So, that's, sometimes it's not really a true dialogue. They're not all thinking about it. They're not all thinking. It's just agreeing with Socrates, and that's a problem. Right, so, did I write that one twice? So that's what he tells Theaetetus. And he makes some people angry by asking questions. I guess I put that question up twice. And what does he do in kindness? What is Socrates' idea of kindness? It's not making people happy, is it? He's perfectly happy for people to be furious at him and to think he's a terrible person and to hate him. The kindness thing is, does anyone want to guess what he thinks is the thing he does in kindness? Yeah.
He lets them go.
No. That's not what yes.
It's a foolish notion away from them?
Yes, right. He takes a foolish notion away from them. So, I try to maintain a very comfortable attitude about being wrong. If I'm wrong about something and somebody points out somewhere I'm wrong, I try to say thank you. because being wrong is not a good state to be in. You know, have you got, do you see people like this out there? Do you have people you know who you don't dare disagree with? I mean, there are people out there in the world that I really do not want to talk to, because inevitably it'll be them yelling at me or trying to bully me into believing something that I think is wrong, and they just won't give up. And ever known someone who would never admit that he's wrong? No? Or am I the only? Oh yeah, okay, yeah, right. It's if you correct them, you're actually doing them a favor, because if they have a stupid idea and they say it to you, and you say, well, you know, actually, blah blah blah. That's not so bad. You're a friend. You're a nice person. You know. But what if they go off and they say it to someone who doesn't have your tact? You know, they can expose themselves as an idiot. I mean, I've said stupid things to strangers, and then gone, oh my God, no, 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 and you know, I made a fool of myself. Well, if you can stop me from making a fool of myself sometime in the future, you're doing me a favor, aren't you? Or at least that's what Socrates would say. All right. Okay, so that went pretty quickly. What I think, first, well, all right, any questions about about the dialogue, about how Socrates sees himself, about how all this relates to philosophy or philosophy in general? Yes?
I thought that when you took away the foolish notion, that made people angry too.
Yes, it does.
So I could have put that answer for number 8 too?
Say again?
Could I put that as the answer for 8? Where you said that
Oh yeah, yeah. Taking away a foolish notion makes people angry, but it's done in kindness. I'm just doing this to be kind to you. Ever had that happen? You know, I'm just trying to help. But that wasn't, you know, taking away my foolish notions. It was, I don't know, breaking something. Right, so, yeah, that's a very good thing. Yeah, taking away the foolish notion is what made them angry. That would be the answer to that. And also, you know, it's kind. So, yeah.
I had a question about one of the practice questions that you posted on the website.
Okay.
Okay. There was a certain quote saying, "Oh, I practice the same art." I didn't really know what Socrates meant by art.
Oh, midwifery. The idea art. What does art mean? Do you know what an artisan is?
Artist?
Artisan. Someone who makes something. There's a bunch of words that we don't use very much nowadays due to industrialization, mass manufacturing. Well, okay. Do you guys know what a craft beer is? A true craft beer? Yeah. Okay. So there are people who may have very small breweries to make, well, you know, Anheuser-Busch produces something like 1 billion gallons a day of fizzy dishwater. Coors. I didn't think there was anything closer to water than Coors until I heard of Coors Light. And I think Coors Light is actually weaker than water. It's less like beer than water is. Right. So I drink things like Samuel Smith's Organic Oatmeal Stout or Young's Double Chocolate. I drink P.S. Celis White or Monk's Cafe Flemish Sour Ale. The range of things that's available in beers, well, there's actually, you know, there's a lot of good stores now, Total Wine and More, Bevmo. There's like 3 or 4 really good liquor stores up in Los Angeles. There's Vendome, is really good. I just went to Total Wine and we got some really good absinthe. Seriously good absinthe. Yeah, my daughter's just getting into drinking, so she makes a marvelous mojito, best mojitos I've ever tasted. Seriously. I love my kid. And she came back from Scotland and gave me a little tiny bottle of one of the best scotches. But all right, so art, right? When Budweiser makes beer, that's not art. That's just mass manufacturing. When Pierre Celis or the folks down at Stone Brewery or Lost Abbey make beer, that's more like an art, right? An art is a set of techniques, a way of making something. So carpentry is an art. You know, a fine furniture maker? When sofas and tables and cabinets are banged together in a factory, that's not really an art in this sense. But when you've got a guy who splits his own veneer and lays it in and glues mortise and tenon and that kind of stuff, that's more of what an art is. And back 3,000 years ago, there pretty much just was art. Right? They didn't have machinery to do much in the way of manufacture. Right? They've had potters and people who would turn pots and things like that for
All by
containers.
hand.
Sam?
All by hand.
All by hand, pretty much everything by hand. Some tools, a lot of tools, molds, things like that, and they could do things in mass, but generally this was all handwork. So when he says an art, midwifery would be an art. Okay. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Good. All right, that was a good question. Anyone else with a question? All right, well, yes.
On one of the earlier questions, it says why Socrates is different from the midwives. Can it be possible because Socrates is working with a woman and the midwife is working with a woman.
Mm-hmm.
However, Socrates is experimenting on boys. Be possible?
I wouldn't say he's experimenting on the boys. I would say ancient Greek society was very, 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 very sexist. Almost horribly most horribly sexist. People like Plato and Epicurus were dangerous radicals because they proposed educating women. Epicurus had female students. Socrates said that women were as smart as men. Not Socrates. Plato said that women were as smart as men and should be as much in charge as men. Nobody likes that. So Socrates would mainly be talking to men, yes. But the most important difference is that Socrates is working with ideas, and the midwife is working with actual babies, with actual pregnant women, right? And men are mad at Socrates, are angry with Socrates because they've got a favorite idea has been shown to be rubbish, whereas women in childbirth are angry because they're in excruciating pain. Pain that I can only imagine, I cannot even begin to imagine. Back in the day before they had epidurals. Although I think they had some kinds of drugs. So, okay. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to just sort of go over some of the basics of the Meno. Right? And then we're going to talk about Socrates' general argument. And we'll take a break. I'll send you guys off for a 15-minute break. And after the break, I'm going to talk about how Socrates' argument is laid out logically. And then we'll start talking about what's wrong with it, and then talk about how to criticize arguments in general. So this is going to try to be a model of how to tease out an argument, how to represent an argument, how to represent it, how to analyze it logically, and finally how to criticize it. Because that's something I want you guys to try to do in your papers, is to look at texts or things you think up yourself, try and work out and clarify and organize arguments, and then criticize them. Right, so, so what is Socrates' thesis about the soul? Oh, does anyone remember? What was Socrates' thesis about the soul? Yes.
The soul is immortal.
Oh, yeah, that was the point. Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry.
And you- same thing. All right. So. One thing about a translation is that some words are not translated exactly right. So the word that we render as soul would be psyche in the Greek, which is more like mind. So and this is kind of a radical idea for the Greeks. The very, very ancient Greeks didn't really have that much idea of an afterlife. They had their religion, and there was sort of something where shades go after they die, but they weren't really considered to be you. It was sort of like just sort of like a bit of you, or a shadow of you. So this is this radical thing, and primarily it's the mind. It's not something that's attached to the mind. It is actually the thinking part. So that's what Socrates' thesis about the soul. So what did Socrates think that learning is? Yes?
It's the collection.
Recollection, yes. You gonna say?
Yes, sir.
Recollection? Recollection over there too? All right. Yeah, good. Okay, you guys did really well on this thing. I was really worried that nobody would understand any of this. So, yeah. So, we call it learning. Recollection. What's another word for recollection? Remembering. Yeah. We're remembering it. Okay. So, what does Socrates tell the boy to do? What is the task that Socrates gives the boy?
He has to figure out the shape or whatever he's working on. So he tells him to do one line, and then to double it, and to think it.
This is called the square doubling problem. Those little drawings I put in, were they helpful?
Yes.
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 Especially, yeah, that one.
Because they were a bitch to write. Yeah, and I kept having to redo them because I'd do a little bit wrong, and then there wouldn't be enough room for the letters, and so doing everything on the fly. So here's a square, 2 foot by 2 foot.
Mhm.
How do we make one that's exactly twice the size? And the first thing that the slave boy says, well, double the length of the side. So we make one that's how many times the size?
Twice.
That's 4. We want twice. How many times is this?
4 times.
That's 4, right? And then eventually they get to
The diagonal.
drawing in the diagonals. And what's the relationship between the area of the orange square and the area of the original black square? Yeah, it's twice. And if you look, you can see these triangles. There's two of them here. 1, 2. And there's 4 triangles of exactly the same size in the orange square. 1, 2, 3, 4. 2 being more than 4. So this, you know, we don't even know the length of this thing. All we know is that it's the diagonal of this, or it's the hypotenuse of this triangle. There's the diagonal of this square, but because it cuts this square exactly in half and then multiplies that half, 1/2, 4 times, it's twice the area. Has everyone got that? It's actually not important that we get that, but it's just kind of cool. So that's what Socrates tells the boy to do. Okay, now according to Socrates, how did the boy do it? By... Now, have you ever not remembered a film? You've forgotten that you went to see a film, you've seen a film, and then someone says, you saw this film, and like, it's happened to me. Oh no, I never saw that film. Yeah, you are, because it was like this. And like, no, I never saw the film. And then the guy in it did this and this, and I go, oh yeah, I remember that. I must have seen that film, because it was this thing and that thing, and then you remember, right? So Socrates says, basically, he jogged the boy's memory.
That he recalled it, it was a word.
Yeah, jogged the boy's memory, and he remembered how to solve the math problem. Right? So, so Socrates says there's 2 possible sources of knowledge. Can anyone remember what they are, or what one of them is? Yes?
One of them innate.
Right, innate.
Innate.
Yeah, innate.
When he's born with, right?
And what's the other one? The mundane one?
Learned it, right? We learned it.
Yeah,
We were taught it,
right. He learned it, was taught.
or it either came from prior lifetime.
Actually, was taught is better. Right. He was taught it. That's the other possible source of this information that he's come up with, that he's remembered, is that he was taught it.
Okay.
So there's the 2 possible sources of knowledge. And what does Socrates say about this second possibility, that he was taught it? What does Socrates say about it? Say again?
It's unlikely because he's a slave.
Yeah, yeah. It doesn't just say it's unlikely. It says it's impossible. It rules it out. Oops. All right, so what does Socrates conclude from this?
That he was,
Say again?
oh, that was from a prior knowledge, a prior life. or-
Yeah, that is from a prior life.
Yeah.
What else?
The soul goes around.
Yeah,
many
soul goes
different
around.
ways. The question I have, and I don't
Yeah.
know whether this has anything to do with it, also, when I read it, said it was also lives, past lives here and in the netherworlds, which sounded a little freaky. What did they mean by the netherworlds? Did
Okay.
they have a certain,
I'll get to that. Let me not write those.
okay.
Well, nether means below. So the netherworld is literally is the world below.
The heaven and earth.
No, this is before those ideas existed. In the realm of Hades, there was Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades.
Yeah.
And they were divvying up the universe, and Hades was like the younger brother, so he got the short end of the stick. Zeus got where? The heavens, the city of the great city of Olympus, on top of Mount Olympus, but like higher. Poseidon got what?
Water.
The oceans, yes. Poseidon got the water realm, and Hades got the underworld, or the nether realm, right? The Netherlands, right? Not the Netherlands. That's in Europe. I don't know. Maybe Hades. The netherworld. It's the realm of Hades, the god of the underworld. And at Socrates' time, there really wasn't a ramified mythology about this. The Socrates is like, I don't know, 500 BC, something like that, 600, 700, I've forgotten, I've no clue. But it was definitely big time BC. So 2,500 years ago, the ideas, later on they developed different ideas. It's like three realms. Eventually there's three realms in the netherworld. There's Elysium and there's Tartarus, and you really want to go to Elysium because it's all bucolic with fields and stuff like. You don't want to go to Tartarus because that has demons and fires and stuff like that, and low property values, and there's no good Thai restaurants or anything.
Real ghetto.
Yeah, it's terrible. Tartarus is just, no, don't let the real estate agent steer you there. They're just after their commission. So that's the realm. But Socrates doesn't really mean that, because Socrates is one of these intellectual types which everything is abstract. There are some people who have an image in our society, who have an image of God as this big bearded guy who's waggling his finger at Adam, and then this spark, and Adam's like, oh, I'm alive. And there are other people who see God in very, very abstract terms, like God doesn't have gender. Some people will go crazy. A friend and I were sitting in a coffee shop once, chatting, and this woman comes by and tries to sell us stuff for her church, for her cult, basically. Go to buy this and she won't stop. Right? She keeps trying to get us to, and then I finally look at her and say, "We have no money." And she goes, "Oh," and she starts wandering off, and she says, "God bless you." And one of us says, "I'm sure she will." "No, God's a man." "No, God's a woman." "No, God's a man." "No, God's a woman." And it's like, this was fun. It's like, okay, just keep going and going and going to see whether she'll give up. And eventually she gave up and left, but it was fun while it lasted. So, so some people, the idea of God having gender is kind of meaningless. Because to them, God is seen completely in the abstract as a particular kind of creative force with setting certain moral rules or something like that. For other people, God is a guy who can get cranky and destroy the world. Because he doesn't like the way, oh my God, you painted it blue. Death. So, the same thing actually with the Greek gods or the Greek mythology, the Greek pantheon, was that some people saw they were basically abstract forces. Socrates was one like that. He really wasn't big on the whole Greek gods and myths and things. He was much more analytical. So when he says netherworld, it's unclear what he really means. And it could be just sort of a sort of a parking garage for souls, right? Or a particular... Plato ramified this a bit, developed this a bit with the world of forms and stuff like that. But right. So the idea, the overall conclusion, slave has lived before, has past lives on earth where he got information. And soul is immortal. Right. And knowledge is comes to the conclusion that knowledge is innate. Okay, so when we come back from the break at about, let's say 8:10 by that clock, try to be here by 8:08, right? So we're all here when I start talking. We'll talk about what all this means. All right, thank you very much for your attention and participation. You guys were really great.